obviously, thank you very much, Lord Howell. I think your emphasis on the changes in the digital environment, on the changes in the world landscape in terms of power and persuasion in quote-unquote a dangerous world are profound. Your vision for the Commonwealth, I think, also is profound and opens many doors for the UK and for all of us. We'll shift now to a panel discussion, and we've asked each of the panelists to speak for about 5 minutes from their perspective. And then we will have discussion among ourselves. If there's time, we will also take questions, probably just a few right at the end. Let me introduce our panelists. As I said, it sounds like a bad joke. It's sort of a statesman, a lawyer, an economist, and a professor walk into a bar and I think what happens is you discover people that have one thing in common. They are profoundly concerned about the world at this time. They are willing to put themselves out as commentators. All of these panelists are writing and thinking and talking every day about the subjects that were introduced by Lord Howell. What we find from them is an intelligent discourse and a changing set of perspectives that I think informs us all. Introducing them individually, the professor is Professor Julian Zelizer. Because you don't have a name tag, I'll ask you to wave. Thank you. Julian is the Malcolm Stevens Forbes Class of 1941 Professor of History and Public Affairs at Princeton. He's held fellowships from Brookings, Guggenheim, Russell Sage. Probably most significant as a communicator, he has written 400 op-ed pieces for every conceivable environment. And I think to inform you, among the many books that he's written that have had a profound effect on the understanding of American history and giving context also to the Trump administration in historical terms, he wrote in 2010, The Arsenal of Democracy, The Politics of National Security from World War II to the War on Terrorism. Second, our economist, Ebrahim Rahbari. Ebrahim is the Managing Director and Head of Global Economics at Citi Research. He's a specialist in monetary policy and global investment in trade. His doctorate's from the London Business School, and he's an honors graduate from Oxford. He's a frequent commentator on television and all things economic and presents a profound view of what's going on with trade trends, with monetary trends, with debt, and how they're affected also by the rise of populist governments around the world. And finally, we have our lawyer, that is Sandra Navidi. Sandra is the founder and CEO of BeyondGlobal. It's an international management consultancy. She's a protege of the famous and critical economics professor, Rubini. So she is part of the Rubini Global Economics Group, and they are now indeed part of BeyondGlobal. She was admitted to the bar in the United States, and she's admitted to practice law also in Germany, among her many, many degrees. But going back to an ability to communicate, she's done some 600 interviews in the last 4 years in an array of languages, many in German, many in English. Her best-selling book, I will hold up and tout for 1 second, called Super Hubs, so extremely relevant to the discussion today because it asks, who are the people and how do they network in terms of our new world and how the digital world affects those networks. So with that, I'm going to ask each of you to speak for a few minutes. And if you don't mind, I'd begin with Julian.
Sure. I'm going to stand up if that's all right. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to meet all of you and to be here. Usually a talk, if asked to talk a little bit about the threats that our international system faces, the perspective would be, what does the United States, for me, for an American historian, what do we see abroad, and where does the president need to focus his or her attention on to achieve stability and order? But these are not usual times. Speaking in 2018, I think the remarks have to be a little bit different. Doing this a day after the United Nations was seen laughing at the President of the United States in part of his speech, something is clearly off. I think it's fair right now to ask questions about what the world is seeing here in the United States, and what are some of the threats and problems that stem from our country for all of those who want to maintain the institutions and relationships that were put into place during World War II. I think it's fair to say that we have right now a president whose relationship and feelings about this international system are tenuous at best, if not downright hostile. Despite occasional rhetoric about his support for NATO, this White House really has made questioning the international system of governance a central issue that he has put forward on the agenda. He has repeatedly criticized NATO and members of NATO. He's pulled out of several major international agreements, and he's continued to raise questions, whether at the UN yesterday or on the campaign trail, about whether or not we are in a new era that requires a different set of institutional arrangements, or using his own rhetoric, if we should be moving toward an idea of America first, and really withdrawing from many of our commitments. While Bob Woodward and the anonymous New York Times op-ed writer might be right that there's a two-track presidency working right now in Washington, and that some of the rhetoric doesn't match where the policy will go, I think it's a mistake not to take these questions seriously, and not to see what's going on here could have pretty significant effects on the post-World War II system. What's important, I always teach students, and I say in lectures, is to remember President Trump didn't come out of nowhere. He is a product of our era, not the cause of it. And certainly on foreign policy, some of the strains that we talk about today with him have been building for some time. Whether that is intensified criticism about how NATO works and what U.S. obligations should be to NATO, or whether that is the rising presence of what we might call a more nationalistic part of the Republican Party and even the Democratic Party that have been gaining strength in recent years and who are not as committed to what the World War II or baby boom generation had been, that we're moving into a very different place. And there's lots of examples from the withdrawal from the Kyoto agreement to even the criticism of TPP in the Democratic primaries. You see this has been building, or House Republican positions on immigration and transatlantic movement. So one problem I would throw out for discussion is what is the threat that we actually pose to the international order at this point with this presidency. And the second thing I'll throw out there is equally problematic, and that is about the dysfunction of Washington. Much of my time I write and talk about political polarization that has been taking hold, again, not since November 2016, but since the 1970s, where the parties have moved farther apart, the center has diminished as a real presence on Capitol Hill, and the kind of politics that has become normalized is much more a kind of smash-mouth takedown politics, which leaves no prisoners, but also doesn't leave much policy as well. And again, I look at President Trump as a manifestation of these tensions and changes that have been brewing for a long time now, which are not new to our era, but we're really seeing them play out now. And we're seeing the strains they are putting on our democratic institutions, whether that is about questioning and challenging law enforcement, or the spread of disinformation and the normalization of false information in the public square. All of this is right in front of us now. All of this is right in front of us, and we can see the effects that it's having on our political institutions. And I think the combination that we see right now is an unstable president. I mean politically unstable. And I think he himself would define himself that way. He is not bound by convention, with a partisan firewall in Washington that essentially insulates him politically at this point. And that combination is part of what we're seeing play out on a daily basis, including on foreign policy, giving him space to make some moves that many people in this room might not agree with, but with a kind of political protection, at least for now, that leaves him comfortable straining, testing, and challenging these institutions. This is why our political decisions here in the United States right now loom so large around the globe. This is why the future of the international system, in part, will depend on our political future and how we handle our current challenges. Of course, in the end, this will be decided by the democratic will, but I'm a believer that if we are worried about these challenges and want to deal with them, it will ultimately require a kind of institutional soul-searching in this country to try to reverse some of the trends that have been building now for over 4 decades. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Now we turn to Ebrahim Rahbari, our economist from Citi.
It's a great pleasure to join you today, to join this very distinguished event in these very distinguished halls, and to deal with topics that are very dear to my heart as an international economist in one of the world's global institutions, but also a triple immigrant, of course. And as an economist, there's a bit of a silver lining always when we are faced by such daunting challenges and risks. We tend to be more in demand. We are a bit counter-cyclical. We tend to be more in demand when times are challenging. And in my personal situation, my father is a psychiatrist. I have 2 brothers who are doctors. When everybody's happy, it's not just bad for business, it's a minor family emergency. But what I would like to do today in my brief remarks is just to shine a light on some of the domestic issues when it comes to relationships, when it comes to the need to build bridges, some themes which came through in Julian's remarks as well. I would like to talk briefly about what I would call the paradox of polarization and maybe the importance of skin in the game, and I'll tell you in a second what that's about. But let me begin by just saying something slightly positive, and I'll anticipate it will probably be the only positive thing I will say. The outlook right now for the global economy is actually remarkably okay. And I say this because we've actually faced a great number of shocks already over the last 12 months. We've had probably the biggest trade tensions we've seen in decades. We've had rising oil prices. We've had a slowing China. We had issues in Europe, in particular around Italy, but also a Brexit process, which isn't maybe generally seen as quite as benign as some of the earlier remarks suggested. And despite all that, we're looking at labor markets where unemployment rates are at multi-decade lows. In the US, probably the lowest we've seen for 4 or 5 decades. Levels of optimism economically are generally fairly high, and growth remains relatively broad-based, or at least we've seen some catching up for the more laggard parts of the economy. But at the same time, it doesn't seem like people are happy. And I think it goes beyond that. I think there is some more fundamental fragility. And what I mean by the paradox of polarization is that it is possible for every individual entity, for households and businesses, to individually be better off, and still for the system as a whole to be more fragile. So you could perhaps call it the paradox of systems as well. And I think that's the situation that we're facing today in the world economy, but very much in many individual economies as well. And there are many interpretations and causes in there, but I think ultimately it has a lot to do with the questions of us versus them, and that them may not necessarily be a foreigner. It very much applies in a domestic context as well. And these are very broad topics, but what I'm ultimately referring to is what I think is a pretty toxic combination of rising economic polarization. We heard the word polarization before already. Polarization and inequality. Very importantly, declining opportunity and mobility, including in this economy, and equally, if not more importantly, falling trust in institutions, so what people sometimes refer to as social capital and social cohesion as well. And some of the numbers, and it's not just about the numbers, of course, I think are pretty quite stark. And if we just use this country as a reference point, again, the issues are pretty global, but again, they are important in a domestic context. In the US, the US is a bit of an outlier in terms of economic inequalities, but we have all heard some of these data points. Individual wealth inequalities, for instance, the top 1% in this country in terms of wealth now account for about 40% of aggregate wealth, up from 25% in the late 1980s. But it's not just about the extent of economic inequality, it's how we got there. And I think what makes it so corrosive is the decline in mobility and the decline in trust. The US used to be a country of great economic opportunity and mobility throughout the different stratas of society. No longer. It's been declining both in absolute and in relative terms. And now, depending on the measure you use, actually is at best in the middle of its group of peer economies. And in terms of trust, I think some of the data are even more worrying. If you look at the Pew surveys, the Gallup surveys, they essentially show a decline in trust in every type of institution in the last couple of decades. If we think of trust in government, it's declined from levels as high as 70, 80% in the late 1950s and 60s. So this is a very long-running phenomenon, to as little as 20% or less for Congress, even much less most recently. But very importantly, it's not just trust in institutions that has suffered, but it is trust in other people as well. And again, I think the factors here are many. There are many driving reasons for them. Some of them have to do with the fact that we've gone through the deepest recession since the Great Depression not that long ago, but we're also facing fairly rapid social and cultural change, and of course technological change is a worry for many. Now, I told you I'm an economist. I'm not a sociologist, psychologist, not even an interpreter of a social interpreter of economies either. So why do we care from an economic point of view? Well, in a nutshell, societies and economies function better when there is opportunity and when there is more trust. When there's no trust, we need to rely much more on contracts and on rules. And despite the fact that my name doesn't give it away, but despite the fact that I'm German, I think rules are not the answer. And we have to be mindful that in the time of great change, in fact, rules can be quite inflexible. And indeed, the institutions that we create when there is no trust tend to be fairly fragile as well. We know that economic outcomes on average, we know by now, I think this is mainly built on work over the last decade or so, tend to be worse when we have that combination of not just inequality, but what people perceive as illegitimate inequality. At a minimum, average growth rates are no higher when there's a greater inequality, but growth also tends to be more fragile. But there's a very specific current reason. I started by telling you about the relatively benign current trajectory that we're facing globally, but in the end we know that the global economy is cyclical. And just like many other cycles, this one is bound to end. And I deeply worry about our ability to deal with the fallout of this turning point if and when it hits. And this is in part because I doubt, just as the previous speaker did, the ability of the political systems to react. But I also want to just bring up something that most of us are very well aware of. I think economically we have used up a lot of policy space in the last few years in trying to deal with the last big downturn. And just to give you a reference point, when it comes to monetary policy, for instance, we used to lower interest rates by 250, 300 basis points, 350 perhaps on average in the last two recessions in the US or in the developed market average. And right now, if you take out the US, interest rates are already at roughly zero to begin with, and probably won't be rising all that much in the years to come. When it comes to our ability to use pump priming and fiscal policy, again, I think we've used up a lot of the space. Average developed market government debt was 75% in 2007 and rose by about 40 percentage points in the years since, and it's barely budged from there, and that clearly means that we can't raise government spending to the same degree that we did back then. And we all shouldn't forget, I know there's a lot of criticism around of China these days, but China was played a great role in taking us out of that last downturn. And China too has used up a lot of capacity to react to economic downturns, even before thinking about whether it has maybe the same incentive to react in the way that it did last time around. And Let me end perhaps also on a somber note, and maybe even with a call to action. I think the lesson from these observations and the last decades is these are not issues when I refer to the lack of equality of opportunity and trust. These are not issues that will self-correct. That's the minimum that I think we know by now. I mean, there are lots and lots of open questions, but these are issues that require to be addressed. And how do we address them, of course, is a big question, but I think the minimum, a necessary condition, it may not be sufficient, is to make sure that everybody feels like they have skin in the game. And I would say, even though there's a lot of criticism around and a lot of concern, the one positive that we should take away from some of the communication over the last 18 to 24 months is to learn and to understand that you have to give those people a voice that have felt that they were left behind, to give them the impression, the perception that they do have skin in the game. So please keep that in mind. So skin in the game is not just the name of the latest Nike commercial, but I do hope that we can take some of these lessons with us and use forums such as these to come up with specific policy solutions to these pressing issues. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Now we'll hear from our lawyer, but Sandra Navidi has said before so much more. She's a profound voice in macroeconomics and as an investment guru around the world. So thank you so much, Sandra.
I'd like to thank the Foreign Policy Association for your invitation, Hugh for your kind introduction, and you all for your interest. I'm very honored to be here today. I've been asked to speak on trade. Before I start, though, I would like to make reference on Lord Howell's remarks, because I thought it was so important that he highlighted the importance of networks, because networks are the underlying structure of everything. We consist of networks, our environment consists of networks, and if we understand the underlying dynamics that govern all networks, then that will enable us to find better solutions. In my book, Superhubs, I write about human networks, the human superhubs of networks. Donald Trump is an interesting example because he was not an established superhub of the New York business networks, but as soon as he made it to the White House and he became a superhub by virtue of his position, you could see how very quickly established networks aligned themselves with him. And we can see the power, the inordinate amount of power that individual superhubs have, and by virtue of their connections with other superhubs, they gain a disproportionate amount of power. And that brings me to trade. And Julian talked about the assault on institutions. I wrote a piece at the end of 2016 called How Trumpocracy Corrupts Democracy, which was published by Project Syndicate in early 2017. I thought, maybe because of my German-Iranian background, I'm particularly sensitive to these tendencies, but I thought that his autocratic tendencies, that his assault on institutions, be it NATO, be it the World Trade Organization, the United Nations, all the things that have given our post-war world order, how he's trying to throw a monkey wrench into them. Now, with regard to trade, are we in a trade war? Commonly, when countries impose tariffs tit for tat and negotiations break down, we're talking of a trade war, so by that definition we are. The question is, what is Trump's policy? He clearly seeks to disrupt the global trade architecture. Purportedly, he has even threatened to, or was considering to leave the World Trade Organization. He is breaking or threatened to break international agreements. He disregards the law, such as World Trade Organization rules when he imposed tariffs on steel and aluminum. And the question is this all a negotiation tactic? Or is he planning to ultimately completely isolate the United States by disentangling it from supply chains and other interconnections? Is his goal really fair trade, or is it to substantially weaken China and attain global economic hegemony? Donald Trump has very few ideological convictions other than his self-interest, but in trade he does seem to have one. We just mentioned Bob Woodward's book, Fear, where he talks about how Donald Trump had made handwritten notes at a manuscript where he'd written, "Trade is bad," exclamation mark. So he is protectionist because he regards trade not as a win-win situation. He sees it as a zero-sum game. For every winner, there has to be a loser. And the justification of national security considerations, which was the only way that he could unilaterally impose these tariffs, frankly, I would regard as an abuse. Last we checked, Canada was not planning to invade the United States, or Great Britain wasn't planning on dropping bombs on US soil, so it really is completely far-fetched. But he gives simple answers to complex questions in a very complex world that is not linear, and it's complex, it's dynamic, and so he gives people what they want, simple answers, but you can't just pull the plug on a complex self-organizing system that we have erected in the last few decades, or else it's going to crash against the wall, and that would be my fear. Now I have to skip over some, I misunderstood the length of the panel, but so what is the outlook? Generally speaking, there are no winners in trade wars. It seems pretty obvious. Trump has a very confrontational approach. He doesn't leave room for face-saving solutions. Now, to be perfectly clear, nobody argues with the underlying premise of his argument. Does China practice unfair trade? Yes. Does it do illegal technology transfer? Yes. Does NAFTA need to be overhauled and brought in, aligned with our current, much more complex world? Absolutely. And the World Trade Organization, an old, stuffy, bureaucratic organization, also needs to be overhauled. That is all undisputed. What I would take issue is his approach, how he wants to, quote unquote, solve this problem, because Donald Trump's confrontational approach does is prompt retaliation. Once such a trade war is started, it's very hard to dial it back. It typically always escalates, what we're seeing already, which leads to a downward spiral. The World Trade Organization cannot help solve this problem. He has attacked the World Trade Organization, the WTO, and so the end game is unclear. It's unclear what his end game is. Unfortunately, all of these leaders think they have leverage. My leverage is bigger than yours. So theoretically speaking, could the US be self-sufficient? Yes, it's big enough, it's geographically diverse enough, and so is its people. It can make and grow everything itself, but it loses the advantage of the international division of labor. So, all the inexpensive goods, the choices that we have, add to our living standards, and if you take that all out, those would be far lower. China will not cave. It has a much longer horizon and much more market power by virtue of the 1.4 billion people it has. So this is a very dangerous game that Donald Trump is playing, and I think one of the greatest risks we're facing at the moment. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Sandra. I'm going to ask now for the panelists to comment on what they've just heard. Underlying that, Julian has posed a question that is a catalyst. What is the threat that this administration is perceived to take to other parts of the world? And this internationalist panel may have a good perspective on that. I think I'd like to ask Lord Howell to comment first.
Thank you, Jim. Well, what we've all heard is that it's an extremely complex world, an extremely dangerous world, and that a lot of our old assumptions have got to be revised. You've heard really enough from me on the fascinating areas that Sandra has just described, but perhaps I'll just add, for your interest and information, a little more about how the Brexit affair in Europe fits into this wider pattern of change and complexity. I mean, people say, in a sense rightly, that this sort of disassociation of Great Britain, from the rest of continental Europe has been going on since Mrs. Thatcher's time, when she made the memorable remark that having defeated socialism in Britain, she didn't want it to come in through the back door via Brussels. And that set a lot of the people in, I belong to the Conservative Party, it set a lot of people in the Conservative Party who had been very strong supporters of building a post-war European unity into feeling that whatever had been built post-war was now turning into something else. And the something else was not at all congenial to the open trade, open society instincts and a free society and free market instincts of Mrs. Thatcher. So that's deep background. Now, what happened to bring it all to the boil in the first decade of this century really was that the Brexit move really, how can I put it, was driven by a number of endless accumulating intrusions and irritations, plus, and the plus is the important thing, the arrival of the digital age. Because what the digital age said to everybody, even those who don't think very much about these things at all, is that trying to push nations too close together, trying to submerge too much nationality into one ball of wax, into one system, was going to lead to trouble. And indeed, the more you squashed it together, the more you would see forces pulling it apart. On top of that, there began to arrive in Europe, thanks to the microchip and that everybody's got a mobile telephone, tribes and cells and societies of refugees in war-torn areas and economic migrants in even larger numbers could suddenly see that if they could get into the European system, there would be, they were told, enormous benefits, jobs would be available, high wages and so on. And where they felt that there was no future south of the Sahara or in the war-torn, tortured Middle East, people just began to get up in vast numbers and are still doing so. It's now estimated there are about 60 million further refugees in sub-Saharan Africa looking every morning and saying, why can't we somehow get to Europe? We'll take any chance, we'll take any risk, even if we drown on the way, we'll go. So all this created a challenge to the old EU model, which it couldn't face. And the mood in Britain was that we'd like to work with you on the challenge, we'd like to face it, but you've got to have reform in the EU. Where is the reform? And it just wasn't coming. Cameron tried it, got no result. As a result, he then had to go to the referendum with a miserable shopping list, didn't appeal to anybody, and Brexit was the result. So that's the answer to why are we leaving. What happens now, just briefly, there will be nudge and fudge. The talk about a crashing out of the EU would be like amputation of a leg without anesthetic, and that is not something that the European capitals are going to put up with. So while the Commission in Brussels may talk about sacred principles of free movement, which doesn't actually exist very much across European borders, there are plenty of restrictions, in fact. Free movement of capital, well, maybe free movement of people, increasingly no, because they're trying to stop floods of immigrants in every direction, and free movement of goods, well, to some extent, but not as complete. Anyway, the Brussels high priests are trying to defend the principles, and the rest of Europe is saying, wait a minute, let's have some sort of compromise with the Brits. And that's roughly where we are, eyeball to eyeball. It'll turn out, I think, in some sort of fudge. Meanwhile, our politics in Britain is, as I was just saying to somebody in the United States, one of my friends from over here, our politics is almost as complicated, maybe even more complicated than yours, and life is very precarious for governments. But life is very precarious for governments everywhere. You tell me a government where it isn't precarious. The legitimacy and authority and the business of establishing trust in governments is getting difficult even in the autocracies. Even Mr. Putin's got his problems. Even Xi Jinping looks over his shoulder. Perhaps the one strong one is Shinzo Abe at the moment, but he's had his problems too. But most governments, certainly most governments in Europe, are all under constant populist challenge from people who are A, disconnected, or A, disgruntled, and B, connected, not disconnected. They can blog every morning their complaints. So you've got the power of us and the power of one against the power of governments. So that puts Brexit in a broader context, which I thought you might like to know.
Perfect. Thank you so much. I'll turn to Julian now, who is a singular expert on the complexity of our government. So your thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, I think putting it in a global context is obviously very important, and the kinds of changes we're seeing here do fit with what we saw with Brexit and other countries, which are a warning for the durability of some of the threats and challenges that the president is posing. I would add that the president here is not acting on his own. And I think the Republican Party has really changed pretty dramatically in the last, I would say, 2 decades, but certainly in the last decade. And you've seen this play out on an issue like immigration, where even President George W. Bush was really at odds with where the House Republicans were. You saw it with Senator McCain in 2008, who brought on Sarah Palin and was somewhat stunned and shocked by what that meant and what that entailed for his own campaign. And I think some of the arguments that the president is making have some pretty deep roots. They're not a one-off. And so I think as we think about where this all goes and how much this changes and how much some of these policies might outlast him, we have to remember where some of these ideas are coming from. I do think, for example, with this resistance to trade and resistance to these international organizations, there's some really deep support in parts of the Republican Party for that right now. And it's an end in itself. It's not a negotiating tool. It's actually a rejection of any obligation or commitment of the United States to a set of rules. That was the premise of the post-World War II period. We will create a set of rules. We will abide by them. That will create stability, and that will also maintain our own position. I don't think everyone goes by that anymore. The rules are stacked against the United States in this mindset, and so I think that's where that's coming from. So I do think the threat is big, and we're not seeing it all play out now because of the economy. So it's almost an artificial buffer to some of the problems we face.
Great, thank you so much. Ebrahim, your thoughts?
Yes, well, and if I may, I would like to respond to some of Howell's remarks on Brexit very, very respectfully, but perhaps giving you a slightly different perspective in the sense that I think it illustrates how problems, if they're unaddressed, mutate. Now, I'm an EU national. I spent 15 years in the UK, and in 2011, when we were dealing with Greece as the most urgent problem, I coined the word Grexit, so I almost feel culpable in very, very minor form for some of the Brexit debate, or at least the lingo. But I do maybe take a slightly different perspective when it comes to what led to Brexit, what maybe were the problems, and to what degree they were really caused or at least not addressed by the EU, because there were obviously a number of problems. At the time, the UK was the best performing G7 economy, but below the surface, there were a lot of issues. Some of them had to do with immigration, some of them had to do with public services, which again may have to do in part with immigration. But I think it's very difficult to argue that the EU was the sole or even the main cause that these problems weren't addressed. It didn't do a great job in helping to solve a lot of these issues, and I'm sure it obstructed here or there. But I think the general issue was that these problems were not addressed, and then there was an outlet to express the dissatisfaction with the behavior of institutions, governments, and so forth. And I think that in the end ended up playing a major role in the referendum outcome. And I'm not fatally pessimistic, but I think it's unclear whether changing that specific institutional setup, so exiting the EU, will actually be that panacea, will allow you to address these problems, whether the domestic political system in the UK will be much better able to address these problems outside the EU framework. And also with what Sandra mentioned, it's true that trade is not zero-sum, but I think we forgot maybe, or at least didn't address the issue that there are losers. There have been losers, and that we had to find ways to deal with those losses. And some countries did much better than others, but I think by and large, I think a lot of economies didn't do very well. So it's not just about the technicalities of modernizing the global trade framework. It's about dealing with technological, social, cultural change in ways that, again, takes those with us that maybe otherwise would have been left behind. And and also that there are times when people lose privileges that they didn't necessarily deserve, but they still have a real sense of loss when they lose them. So there is real anger, and again, simply to be a realist, we have to find ways to address some of these issues. And I may be able to end with a final note based on what Julian said. I think the future of the international system was always going to be uncertain because of the rise of China. I mean, even before this administration came to power, we had these issues that the WTO didn't work, that we didn't really know how to integrate China into these institutions. I think it's a minor tragedy, maybe a major tragedy over time, that, you know, our best hope of dealing with it was that we had a major system, a major power that has systemic interest. So I worry greatly because not only is the US perhaps a destabilizing force, but it already enters into a situation where I think the global play was up in the air. So, can't give you much hope, but...
Well, there are hopeful elements there, so thank you. Sandra, you're giving us the finale, please.
Yes, so I would say that, or summarize that the underlying reasons for these developments, be it Brexit or the polarization in the US, are pretty similar. They are partially tribal, economic, they're tribal, ethnic, and partially economic. It's very hard to disentangle. They kind of play into each other. The problem has not been globalization. The problem has been the distribution of globalization proceeds. That has been because 90% of the jobs that have been lost in the last decades have not been lost due to globalization, but have been lost due to digitization. And so I think the resulting inequality, be it with regard to opportunity, wealth, and wages, that's what has created or driven this polarization. And then people retreat into their tribes in what they know and what they feel comfortable with. And I think that if you haven't been scared so far, I'm currently writing my next book, which is based on the changing nature of work, digitization and so forth. I'm already pretty well informed, but I've done a lot of research, and what I've read there is really scary because the speed of change is very quick, and what we do know is probably in great likelihood is the jobs that we will lose. What we know we will gain jobs back, new jobs that we haven't even thought about, but we don't know exactly what these jobs will be, and we are not sure how to prepare for this. Politicians don't seem to prepare. Steve Mnuchin said a few months back, digitization, we don't even have it on our radar. That's a problem that will become pertinent in decades from now. So I think it's a problem, short-termism is a problem for democracy, it's a problem for our economy, for CEOs as well. And so nobody's really looking ahead and trying to contemplate how we can tackle this problem, taking companies and CEOs and giving them responsibility, beyond shareholder value and all of that. So I think that we all need to be on our toes and try to, even on an individual level, work on social coherence. Thank you.
Wow, very profound. So I want to thank again our statesman, Lord David Howell, our professor, Julian Zelizer, our economist, Ebrahim Rahbari, and our lawyer, economist, and many things, Sandra Navidi. Also, thank you so much to the Foreign Policy Association for enabling us to convene yet another profound session of thought makers. So with that, thank you for coming and have a good day.